One of my favorite features of Next.js is its built-in file-based routing system. As coming to Next.js from just vanilla React, I was so used to needing to install React Router DOM or some other routing solution and then doing kind of all the boilerplate necessary to get that all set up. And over time, it just kind of becomes pretty tedious to do, and it feels like you're doing the same thing in every single project you use. But in Next.js, it works differently, and I love it so much more than just using vanilla React. So today's video is going to be about this Next.js fundamental of defining routes. Now, there's definitely more to routing than what we're going to cover here, as you can get a little advanced with routing when it comes to parallel routes and route intercepts and all that stuff, which I definitely will cover. But for now, we're just going to cover the fundamentals of like, how do you create different routes in Next.js? So we're going to cover these kind of three main points here and then get into some examples. So I just created this kind of demo project here on Localhost 3000 that we're going to kind of show examples of. So number one, as I kind of alluded to, Next.js has a built-in file-based routing systems where folders are used to define routes. And how this works is that each folder represents a route segment and maps to a URL. You're then going to nest folders to create nested routes. So what I mean by each folder represents a route segment is that if you create a folder that is named settings, or the name of that folder is called settings, then that route segment can map to a actual URL like /settings. And then if you want to create nested routes like /patient/profile, well, in your Next.js project, which I'll show you this in a second, you just create a folder called patient, and then within that patient folder, you'd create a profile folder, and that automatically maps to /patient/profile. Now, one key thing to remember here, as I close these other dropdowns, is that adding a folder doesn't automatically add a public route. You need to add a page.js or TS or JSX or TSX file to make that route publicly accessible. So if you create that patient folder, well, you're not going to have like a /patient route or a URL to go to, or that's accessible publicly, until you actually add a page.file within that folder. However, you could have a folder that has one of these page.files in it, but you could explicitly make that folder private by adding an underscore, prefixing the folder name with an underscore. So let's kind of get into examples of this. So first, let's just show you like what folder is going to map to this home page. And then I'll also show you a settings page that I have set up. So if I go to the code here in VS Code, what you're going to see is I have my home page here. I have my drop-down titles, my drop-down content, and this represents my home page. You can see Next.js fundamentals, defining routes. It is the same thing that we see right here. So that is indeed my home page. Now here in Next.js, we have our app folder, and we're on Next.js 15, the latest Next.js version at the time of recording this. And in this app folder, you can see at the root of this folder, at the kind of top level of this folder, we have some other folders here, but we also have a page.tsx file, as I'm using TypeScript in this project. So this page.tsx file in the root of my app folder, well, that is just going to map to my home page, just at /. So localhost 3000, this is the root of my app folder, and it's going to show this page.tsx file that I have. So here in this page.tsx file, I just export default my homepage component, and this is what is going to show on my home page right here. It is at the root of my app folder. But now let's say I want to create a /settings route. Well, what I would do is within my app folder, I'm going to create another folder within my app directory that is called settings. And then within my settings folder, I just added page.tsx file within here. And this could, of course, be a JS or JSX or TS file as well. But I have this settings page to where I have a React component settings page. I export default, that settings page. So if we go to /settings, since I have a page.file within this settings folder within my app directory, we should see this component being rendered to the page. So if we go to my app and I go to /settings, we see my settings page here. So it is as easy as that to create your different routes in Next.js. It just gives you that out of the box. I didn't have to do any kind of boilerplate setup there, which is super nice. So we looked at the homepage and the settings page, but now let's look at private folders and inaccessible folders with components and fonts. So as you saw here, I had to add this page.file so I could actually go to /settings. But what about this fonts folder? This fonts folder doesn't have a page.file within it, but it is still in the app directory. So if I try to access this fonts folder, what do you think is going to happen here? Well, if you were listening carefully earlier, it's not going to be publicly accessible. I get 404, page cannot be found. And that's because my fonts folder here does not have a page.file within it. If I went ahead and added a page.tsx file within my fonts folder, and I export a default function called fonts, and I just return an H1 saying fonts page, and now I go back to the browser, you see at /fonts, I see this fonts page here. So we made it publicly accessible by adding this page.tsx file. But if I remove this and I move that to trash, and now this fonts folder no longer has a page.file in it, and I come back to my browser, you're going to see that I get 404. This page could not be found. So you need to add a page.file within a folder to actually make it accessible via your URL. Now, we also have this components folder, and we do have a page.tsx file within it to where we just show an H1 with components page. So if I go to /components, we would expect to see this. And what we are going to see is exactly that, components page. But I can make this an explicitly private folder by renaming this and adding an underscore in front of components. That is telling Next.js that even if this folder has a page.file within it, it's going to be private. It's not publicly accessible. So what you see now is that this page cannot be found at /components. Even though I have a page.file within it, it's not going to be publicly accessible because I prefixed the folder name with an underscore. And I really like this pattern. If you're going to have a folder that just contains like components that you're going to use throughout your application, I really like the pattern of explicitly saying, hey, this folder is meant to be a private folder just for components. It's not going to be a publicly accessible route within your application. So you can make a folder private with prefixing the folder name with an underscore. And even if you have a page.file within it, it's not going to make that a publicly accessible route. But now as the final example here, let's come back and make sure I'm not forgetting anything. The final example is going to be looking at nested routes with patient /profile. So if we want to create nested routes, we have this patient folder and we have a page.tsx file within this patient folder. So if I go to /patient, I should see this component rendered to the page because I export default, this patient homepage component. So if we go to /patient, what we see is this patient dashboard here. It's what I'm rendering here on this page. And again, that's because we have a folder with a page.file within it. So this route is going to map to this name of this folder. So within our app directory, it's going to be /patient that it's going to map to. And it's going to render this page.tsx file. But now if I want to create a URL called /patient and then /profile, I would just add a profile folder within my patient folder. So this is going to map to /patient /profile. And then within my profile folder, I of course add a page.tsx file to make this a publicly accessible route at /patient/profile. So if we go to that route, we should see this patient profile page here that I'm exporting within this page.file within my profile folder. So if I go to /profile, we do indeed see this patient profile page. So creating nested routes is basically the same way you define any routes, but you just create folders within folders and then create page.files within those folders, and that's going to create nested routes. And if we wanted to take this further, maybe we want to add a settings page, so /patient/profile/settings. Well, within my profile folder, we just add another nested folder that's going to be settings. And then let me just go ahead and within our settings page, I'm going to just copy this. And then within my settings folder, we need to add a page.tsx file. And then I'll just render this settings page. So if I go to /patient/profile/settings, I should see this rendered page.tsx file. So if I go to /settings now, you see my settings page here. So nesting routes is as easy as just nesting folders. It's going to map just kind of as you would expect intuitively. So as a quick recap here for defining routes, Next.js has a built-in file-based routing system where folders are used to define different routes. And the way it works is that each folder represents a route segment and maps to a URL. So if you create a folder within your application called settings, and you create a page.file within that folder, then it's going to create a route. As long as that folder is within your app directory, it's going to create a route at /settings that you can access. And then if you want to nest routes, you can do what we just did here earlier to where we just create folders within folders that contain that page.file as well within those folders. Now you can also be explicitly private about your folders by prefixing them with an underscore, just like what we do here with our components folder. Even though this has a page.file within it, it is going to remain private here because we prefix it with an underscore. And then even if you have a folder like our fonts folder within your app directory, if you don't add a page.file within it, it is not going to make it publicly accessible. If you're using the underscore pattern, then you might just make this underscore fonts to explicitly say that, hey, this is not going to be a public route. It is just going to be a private folder that we have within our app directory. So that is defining routes in Next.js. There's definitely more to know here, but this really should get you quite a ways, and it's going to be some fundamentals that you're going to use in probably all of your Next.js applications. So thanks for tuning into this, and I will see you in that next one.